it is time for today's goals. So when we do a little wrap up on today's goals, you have arithmetic expressions. You've seen lots of examples of them, using constants and random number generation. And one of the things I always like to do is to take all the stuff that you've learned and put it all together into one big package. And so that's what we're going to do next. Basically, we're going to put this all together in a program called the Dice Simulator to see how all this stuff works. So here's the Dice Simulator program. What I want to do is take you through what this program does and show you what it would do, run it, and then what we're going to do is go through a trace of it step by step so you can understand exactly everything that's going on. So here's our Dice Simulator program inside of our development environment. And you can see there's the comments at the top like we're used to. We're importing random so that we're bringing in random numbers. And similar to a program that you may have seen in the past, what we're going to do is simulate rolling dice to generate random numbers. We're just going to do that where the dice that we roll, that happens inside a separate function, just like when you saw separate functions when we did Carol the Robot. Now we're doing them in Python because, as you know, Carol the Robot was also written in Python. So inside our program here, let me scroll and I can show you the whole program. What we're going to do is inside of our main program, we're going to start off by having a little variable in here that I'll just call die1, which is equal to 10. And as you know, die is just the singular form of the term dice. So we're just setting that to be 10. Then what we're going to do is print out on the screen die1 in main starts as and print out that value of die1, which presumably should be 10. And then we're going to call the roll dice function 3 times. And inside the roll dice function, what's going to happen is if we come up here to roll dice, we're going to simulate rolling 2 dice and adding them together and printing that to the screen. So first, we're going to have a variable called die1, which we're going to get a random integer between 1 and num sides. Num sides is just a constant that's defined up here to be 6. So it's like rolling a regular 6-sided die. And we're going to do that for die1. And we're going to also do that for die2. We're going to generate another random integer between 1 and num sides, which is 6. Then we're going to add die1 and die2 together, put that into total, and print out the total of the 2 dice on the screen. And so that's our roll dice function. And remember, we're going to call that 3 times. And then when we come back to the main program, we're going to print out the value of die1 in main. Now, you might look at this and say, but danger, Maron. I see that there's a die1 over here in main, and you have a variable also called die1 and roll dice. Are those the same thing? Are they? Because they have the same name. And in fact, the thing we want you to realize from this is that the variable die1 in roll dice is a different variable than the die1 in main. The important thing to remember is there's this concept called scope that we talked about a little bit before, which is where does a variable live? And a variable lives inside the function that defined it. So the die1 in main is a variable die1 with that name inside main. That is different than die1 in roll dice. That's just a whole different variable that's inside roll dice. So let's run this program and actually see what happens. So if we go ahead and run this program, down here in our terminal, you can see die1 in main starts as 10. And then we call the roll dice function 3 times. So the first time we call it, it generates 2 random numbers whose total happens to be 7, and that's what it prints out in the terminal. Next time we call roll dice, it generates 2 random numbers, adds them together. The total happened to be 6 in that case, prints that to the terminal as well. And last but not least, the third time we call roll dice, it generates 2 random values, adds them together, and it turns out the total in that case is 5. Now notice that if we rolled 7, 6, and 5 as the total of 2 dice, that means that this die1 in here never could have been 10 because that had to be a value less than 7, 6, or 5. But when we come back here to the main program and we print out the value of die1 in main is, we get 10. Why? Because that 10 is referring to this die1 over here in main that was never changed by any of the calls to roll dice, even though roll dice had its own variable called die1 in it. That is a different variable. So to understand what's really going on, what we need to do is go through this code in detail. And so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take you back to the slides to do that right now. I'm going to take you through the dice simulator in detail to show you what's going on underneath the hood. So here's our main program. We have die1 equals 10. So let me execute that line. And what it would do is I would say, okay, I'm going to have a variable called die1. I'm going to put 10 in that box because that's what you told me. And this die1 is inside main. So this is the die1 that's controlled by main. And so the program starts off, and this is going to be the terminal down here. So I'm just going to show down here what gets printed on the screen. When we do the first line, die1 in main starts as, and it gets me the string version of die1. So that's just the string version of 10. And so it prints out that 10. Then we call roll dice. And when we call roll dice, we are calling a new function. So, hey, roll dice. When I call you, roll dice comes along and says, hey, here I am. I'm roll dice. What do you want to do? And I say, well, we're executing you, roll dice. So it comes along and says, okay, I have internally to me a die1, a die2, and a total. So this is the die1, die2, and total that are inside roll dice. Die1 from main is still hanging out over in main. It's still 10, it's still there, and it's not impacted by what's going on inside this function. So when I say, okay, what's the first line? Die1 equals give me a random integer between 1 and num dice, or num sides. Num sides I know is 6. So what I get is a random number between 1 and 6. I happen to get a 2 in this case, and that's what I store in die1. Then I say for die2, give me a random integer between 1 and 6. I get a 5. Add their total, or create the total, that's 7, and then print that out on the screen. So this prints on the terminal, the total of the 2 dice is 7. At this point, the roll dice function is done. And when it is done, that function says, okay, I go away. And you're like, but what about die1, die2, and total that are inside roll dice? They all go away. Okay, so when I'm done with this call to roll dice, I come back to main. Main's like, hey, roll dice executed, it's fine. And its die1 is still hanging out here and says, I'm the die1 in main. I wasn't impacted by anything that happened in roll dice. Even I heard there's some variable there, like it's got the same name as me. It's not me. I'm kind of like die1 in main, and so its value is still 10. It was unaffected by what was going on in that call. And so if I call roll dice again, just to make this clear, right, I call roll dice again. Roll dice comes along and says, hey, what do you want me to do? Notice when roll dice starts up, its die1, die2, and total have no values because it doesn't remember what the old values were. Every time you call a function, it starts up brand new and says, okay, I have a die1. I'm going to get some random number between 1 and 6 for that. And so it happens to get a 1 for that random value when we call randint. Then for die2, we call randint again to get another random value. We happen to get a 3. We add them together and get a 4, and we print that on the screen. So I get the total of the 2 dice is 4. And now roll dice is done. So it says, okay, I'm done. I go away. And all of my variables internal to me go away. These are what are called local variables. And we'll talk a lot more about these next time, but the idea is when variables are created inside a function, they only exist inside that function, even if they have the same name as some variable inside another function. And so this roll dice is done. That was the second call to roll dice, and you can see inside main, die1 is like, yeah, I'm still 10. Someone told me there was supposed to be some, action going on. I'm just hanging out here. And so we call roll dice a third time, and I will spare you all the details of going through it again, but let's just say it prints out on the screen the total of the 2 dice is 5, and die1 is completely unaffected by that. And so at the end of the program, in our last line, we write out die1 in main is, and then the results of which is just 10, because it's been unchanged even after all the calls to roll dice. All right, so that's what's going on there in terms of having variables inside different functions. They are actually different variables, even if they have the same name. And at this point, you are rocking it, my friends, because you have now gotten a bunch of Python, you've gotten expressions, you've gotten constants, you've gotten random numbers, and we've put it all together in this much bigger program. So how does that make you feel, Carol? Oh yeah, it's happy dance time. That's right, because Carol never really leaves us. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care.